Help. It's the one word we all rely on in moments of desperation. But for these three women, asking for it opened the door to their worst nightmares. Are you ready to uncover what happened? Listen carefully, because it could happen to anyone. The autumn wind scattered crimson leaves across Sarah Miller's windshield as she drove past the Welcome to Millbrook sign, her Honda Civic loaded with the remnants of her former life. At 28, starting over wasn't part of her plan, but neither was finding divorce papers on her kitchen counter 6 months ago. The small town's Victorian houses and maple-lined streets offered a stark contrast to her previous life in Boston, where memories of her failed marriage lingered on every corner. Sarah's real estate agent had found her a modest apartment above an antique bookstore, its bay windows overlooking Main Street. The rent was surprisingly affordable, though the hollow rooms only amplified her solitude. Each night, she would sit by the window, watching families and friends gather at the local cafe, their laughter a painful reminder of everything she'd left behind. It was during one of her aimless walks through town, trying to escape the suffocating silence of her apartment, that Sarah first noticed the flyer. Posted on the community board outside the local grocery store, its elegant calligraphy caught her eye. Circle of Empowerment, find your true sisterhood. The paper was thick and cream-colored, with an intricate silver border design that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon light. Something about the carefully chosen words and the promise of belonging made her fingers tremble as she wrote down the address. The meeting location turned out to be a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its weather-worn facade partially hidden behind overgrown hydrangea bushes. Sarah almost turned back at the wrought iron gates, but the warm light spilling from the windows and the sound of gentle music drew her forward like a moth to flame. Diana Blackwood, the group's leader, had an immediate presence that filled the room. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and her green eyes held a depth that seemed to peer straight into Sarah's soul. The silver pendant around her neck caught the firelight, its strange symbols appearing to dance in the glow. Her welcome was effusive, almost uncomfortably so, as though she'd been expecting Sarah all along. Elena Reed, a willowy woman with auburn hair, quickly took Sarah under her wing. Her constant presence and eager assistance in helping Sarah settle into Millbrook should have been comforting, but something about her enthusiasm felt rehearsed, like lines delivered in a play whose ending was already written. The circle proved surprisingly well connected. Within weeks, Sarah had secured a position at the local library through Diana's recommendation. Elena helped her find a better apartment, coincidentally in the same building where several other group members lived. Their kindness was overwhelming, yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it came with invisible strings. Strange details began to accumulate like dust in the corners of her awareness. The midnight meetings that some members attended, their faces drawn and pale the next day. The way certain women would suddenly stop attending gatherings, their absences explained away with vague stories of moving or family emergencies. The peculiar symbols that appeared in the most mundane places, carved into door frames, stitched into throw pillows, painted in barely visible silver on the mansion's walls. Diana's mentorship became increasingly intense. She insisted on weekly private meetings in her study, where the air hung heavy with incense and ancient leather-bound books lined the walls. Her discussions about female empowerment and ancient wisdom often veered into cryptic territory, with references to vessels of power and the sacred nature of the approaching autumn equinox. Elena's behavior grew equally unsettling. Her friendly chatter frequently turned to pointed questions about Sarah's family connections and whether anyone would miss her if she decided to travel for an extended period. Her usual warm smile would slip occasionally, revealing something harder beneath, especially when she spoke of the upcoming equinox celebration and how Sarah would play a special role in the ceremony. It was during a Saturday afternoon spent helping organize the mansion's basement that Sarah's unease crystallized into horror. Behind a shelf of canning supplies, she discovered a hidden room containing a massive ancient tome, its pages filled with carefully documented names and dates spanning centuries. Each entry followed a pattern: a woman's name, her age, and the word vessel, followed by the date of an autumn equinox. The most recent entry was from the previous year, a name Sarah recognized as a former member who had supposedly moved to Oregon. As Sarah pieced together the truth, her hands trembling as she turned the brittle pages, she realized the true nature of the circle of empowerment. The silver pendants, the midnight meetings, the disappearances, all part of an ancient pattern, with herself as its newest thread. The circle wasn't about empowerment at all. It was about sacrifice, power, and immortality, with Diana Blackwood at its dark heart. The revelation in the basement marked the beginning of Sarah's waking nightmare. Each interaction with the circle members now carried sinister undertones, their friendly smiles masking deadly purpose. The weight of the ancient book's truth pressed against her consciousness, making it increasingly difficult to maintain a facade of naive enthusiasm. Diana's true nature emerged in subtle ways that Sarah might have missed before. The way her green eyes tracked Sarah's movements during meetings, calculating and cold beneath their maternal warmth. How her discussions of ancient traditions now carried unmistakable undertones of blood and sacrifice. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the firelight, its symbols no longer mysterious but threatening. Research conducted in secret at the library revealed centuries of disappearances in Millbrook, all young women, all during the autumn equinox. The pattern stretched back to the town's founding, when Diana Blackwood first appeared in historical records, looking exactly the same as she did now. The photos and paintings spanning different eras showed the same sharp-featured face, the same knowing smile, only the clothing changing with the times. Elena's role became clearer as well. She was Diana's lieutenant, the one who helped identify and groom suitable vessels for the ritual. Her constant presence in Sarah's life now felt less like friendship and more like surveillance. The auburn-haired woman appeared at unexpected moments, outside Sarah's apartment, at her workplace, even during her morning runs. Each encounter was accompanied by increasingly pointed remarks about the approaching equinox and Sarah's important role in the ceremony. The other circle members began dropping their masks as the autumn equinox drew closer. Their weekly gatherings took on a more ritualistic tone, with ancient chants echoing through the Victorian mansion's halls. The silver pendants they wore gleamed with unnatural brightness, and their eyes held a hungry anticipation whenever they looked at Sarah. New symbols appeared around the house daily, carved into windowsills and painted on ceiling beams, forming an invisible cage of dark magic. Sarah discovered more horrifying details about the ritual in the ancient book she'd smuggled from the basement. The chosen vessel wouldn't simply disappear, she would be consumed. Diana maintained her immortality by absorbing the life force of specially prepared young women, each sacrifice adding another generation to her unnaturally long existence. The process required months of preparation, with the vessel being subtly enchanted through seemingly innocent group activities. The shared meals, the meditation sessions, the sisterhood ceremonies. The realization that she'd been ingesting small amounts of magical preparations throughout her time with the circle sent Sarah into a panic. The tea Diana always served during their private meetings, the ritual bread shared at gatherings, even the herbs Elena had recommended for her apartment, all had been part of the groundwork for the final ceremony. 3 days before the equinox, Diana finally revealed her true self during what was supposed to be their regular mentoring session. The maternal mask dropped completely as she described the honor of being chosen as this year's vessel. Her voice carried centuries of power as she explained how Sarah's essence would help maintain the circle's ancient traditions. The room grew cold as Diana's form seemed to shift and change, her elegant appearance momentarily revealing something ancient and hungry beneath. Sarah's attempt to feign acceptance of her role fooled neither Diana nor Elena. They could sense her terror and resistance, but seemed almost pleased by it. The fear and desperate hope of escape would make the final ritual more potent. Diana explained with the casual cruelty of someone who had performed this ceremony countless times before. The doors of the Victorian mansion were left conspicuously unlocked, the grounds unguarded. It was a deliberate taunt. They were so confident in their magical preparations that they believed escape was impossible. Sarah's body felt heavy and slow, her thoughts increasingly clouded by the weeks of subtle enchantments. Even the town itself seemed to be under the circle's influence, its streets becoming a maze that always led back to the mansion whenever she tried to flee. As the equinox approached, Sarah's dreams were filled with visions of previous vessels, their faces drawn from the book's careful documentation. They reached out to her with desperate warnings, their voices echoing with the horror of their final moments. Each morning, she woke to find new symbols painted on her skin in silver, the circle's magic tightening its grip on her body and soul. Emma Turner's hand trembled as she filled out the new patient forms in Dr. Eleanor Weber's waiting room. The leather chair creaked beneath her with every slight movement, and the ticking of an antique wall clock punctuated the silence. Her eyes darted to the dark corners of the Victorian-style office, searching for the same shadowy figures that had been haunting her apartment for weeks. The decision to seek therapy hadn't come easily. As a software developer who prided herself on logic and rational thinking, Emma had spent countless hours trying to explain away the inexplicable events that had started shortly after moving to her new apartment. At first, it was small things, a coffee mug that wasn't where she'd left it, or her laptop switching on in the middle of the night. But then the whispers started, barely audible yet distinctly present, especially during her late-night coding sessions. Dr. Weber's office, with its dark wooden panels and carefully arranged psychiatric diplomas, offered an odd mixture of comfort and unease. When the therapist finally emerged to greet her, Emma was struck by her precise movements and penetrating gaze. Dr. Weber carried herself with an air of authority that seemed to demand trust. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her charcoal gray suit impeccably pressed. During that first session, Emma found herself revealing more than she'd intended. She described the shadowy figures that lurked in her peripheral vision, the way her furniture seemed to shift positions by inches when she wasn't looking, and the increasingly coherent whispers that called her name in the dead of night. Dr. Weber's pen moved across her notepad with unusual intensity, her questions probing deeper than Emma expected from an initial consultation. The isolation of her new life had begun to feel suffocating. Working remotely had seemed ideal when she'd accepted the position 6 months ago, but now her apartment felt less like a home office and more like a cage. Her closest friend lived 3 states away, and her attempts to connect with local coding groups had fizzled out as the paranormal activities escalated. By their 3rd session, Dr. Weber suggested an unconventional approach to treatment. The therapist's eyes held an unusual gleam as she proposed documenting Emma's experiences through a combination of sleep studies and environmental monitoring. The equipment arrived the next day, small cameras and sensors that Dr. Weber insisted would help validate Emma's experiences and track any unusual patterns. Within weeks, the paranormal activity intensified dramatically. Objects no longer just moved, they flew across rooms. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Emma began experiencing gaps in her memory. She would find herself standing in different rooms with no recollection of how she got there. Her computer screen filled with code she didn't remember writing. Dr. Weber's interest seemed to grow with each new incident. Their sessions became longer, more frequent, filled with detailed questioning about every supernatural occurrence. The therapist's office felt different now, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Emma noticed how Dr. Weber's hands would tremble with excitement as she reviewed the footage from the monitoring equipment, her professional demeanor occasionally slipping to reveal something more obsessive underneath. After 2 months of therapy, Emma began discovering strange symbols drawn in chalk throughout her apartment, behind furniture, under rugs, along the edges of her windows. She had no memory of drawing them, yet the chalk dust stained her fingers. Her attempts to wash away the symbols only led to their reappearance in new locations, more elaborate and numerous than before. The mounting strangeness of her situation finally prompted Emma to do what she did best: research. Late one night, fighting against an unusual drowsiness that had become common, she began digging into Dr. Weber's background. Hidden behind pages of accolades and published papers, she found older articles about controversial experiments in parapsychology and consciousness manipulation. The names of former research subjects had been redacted, but their experiences bore unsettling similarities to her own. When Emma tried to cancel her next appointment, the withdrawal symptoms began. Intense migraines, violent tremors, and visions so vivid she could no longer distinguish them from reality. Dr. Weber's voice on the phone was calm, insistent. Missing sessions now could be dangerous. Emma agreed to continue, but as she hung up the phone, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Behind her stood a dark figure, more solid than any she'd seen before, and for the first time, she wasn't sure which was more frightening, the entity itself, or the satisfied smile she glimpsed on its shadowy face. The realization that she had become Dr. Weber's unwitting test subject hit Emma with devastating clarity. Her fingers trembled as she systematically documented everything. The timing of her blackouts, the appearance of new symbols, and the steady escalation of supernatural phenomena that seemed to coincide perfectly with her therapy sessions. One particularly sleepless night, after discovering a fresh set of elaborate symbols traced in white chalk across her bedroom ceiling, Emma made her decision. She waited until Dr. Weber's office would be empty, during a conference the therapist had mentioned attending. The lock on the Victorian building's back door proved surprisingly simple to bypass with skills Emma had learned during a cybersecurity course. Physical locks, she reflected grimly, were often the weakest link in any security system. The office looked different in the darkness. Moonlight filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the antique furniture, and the ever-present ticking of the wall clock seemed louder, more ominous. Emma's heart pounded as she methodically searched through filing cabinets and drawers, her phone's flashlight beam revealing years of carefully documented research. The discovery of a hidden panel behind Dr. Weber's bookshelf made Emma's blood run cold. Inside, she found dozens of patient files, each containing detailed logs of induced paranormal experiences. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what she was reading: systematic manipulation of perception through a combination of psychotropic drugs, suggested hallucinations, and carefully orchestrated environmental triggers. Emma recognized some of the substances mentioned in the files from her own research: medications known to cause memory gaps and heighten suggestibility. Her growing nausea had nothing to do with withdrawal, as she realized the tea Dr. Weber insisted on serving during their sessions had likely been more than just chamomile and honey. A sudden noise from the hallway froze Emma in place. The beam of her flashlight caught movement, a dark figure standing in the doorway. For a moment, she thought it was Dr. Weber, returned early from her conference. But as the shape moved closer, Emma realized with rising terror that it was too tall, too fluid in its movements to be human. The temperature in the room plummeted. Emma's breath came out in visible puffs as she backed away from the entity. Unlike the shadowy figures she'd glimpsed in her apartment, this presence felt ancient, aware, and undeniably real. The air crackled with a tangible energy that made her skin prickle and her phone's screen flicker erratically. The sound of keys in the front door broke the moment. Emma fumbled with the patient files, shoving them back into their hiding place as Dr. Weber's measured footsteps echoed through the building. The entity remained motionless, watching, as Emma slipped behind a heavy curtain. Dr. Weber entered her office like a hunter sensing prey, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. She moved directly to the hidden panel, checking its contents with quick, anxious movements. The shadowy figure drifted closer to her, and for the first time, Emma saw genuine fear flash across her therapist's face. What followed seemed to unfold in slow motion. Dr. Weber began chanting something in a language Emma didn't recognize, pulling a piece of chalk from her pocket. But before she could complete whatever ritual she was attempting, the entity surged forward. The temperature dropped further, frost crystallizing on the windows. The wall clock stopped ticking. Emma used the distraction to run, her feet carrying her down the stairs and into the street. Behind her, Dr. Weber's voice rose in a desperate crescendo before cutting off abruptly. The Victorian building's windows blazed with an impossible darkness, darker than the night sky, before returning to normal. The police found Dr. Weber's office in perfect order the next morning. No sign of disturbance except for a complex pattern of symbols burned into her desk's wooden surface. Of the therapist herself, they found no trace. The official investigation revealed dozens of former patients with similar stories of exploitation and manipulation, though none could explain the doctor's final disappearance. Emma deleted the therapy apps from her phone and threw away the monitoring equipment from her apartment. The supernatural occurrences gradually subsided, though on quiet nights she sometimes still catches glimpses of movement in dark corners. But these shadows no longer feel threatening, more like silent guardians keeping watch. She's learned to live with the understanding that some forces in the universe can't be documented or controlled, and those who try often discover too late that they've drawn the attention of something beyond their comprehension. The only evidence of her experience remains in a small box at the back of her closet. A piece of chalk, a copy of her patient file, and a single photograph from Dr. Weber's hidden collection. In it, the same dark figure that appeared in the office stands behind an unsuspecting Dr. Weber, its form growing more distinct with each passing year, as if it's slowly developing the patience to make itself known. The late summer sun cast long shadows across Rachel Winter's kitchen as she stared at her phone, reading and rereading the text message from her babysitter. After 2 years of reliable childcare, Jessica was moving across the country for graduate school, leaving Rachel and 6-year-old Lily in an impossible situation. Rachel pressed her fingers against her temples, fighting back a stress headache as she mentally scrolled through her options. Her marketing firm's biggest campaign launch was just weeks away, and her boss had made it clear that working from home wasn't an option. In the backyard, Lily's laughter floated through the open window as she played with her stuffed unicorn, oblivious to her mother's mounting anxiety. Rachel watched her daughter's dark ponytail bounce as she twirled in the fading light, her heart aching with the weight of single parenthood. The promotion she'd received last month should have been cause for celebration, but instead, it only added to the crushing pressure of balancing career and motherhood. The solution appeared the next morning in the form of Margaret Rose, their elderly neighbor from 2 doors down. Rachel had often noticed the woman tending to her immaculate garden, which somehow bloomed year-round with roses in impossible shades of deep burgundy and pale pink. Mrs. Rose approached their shared fence as Rachel rushed Lily through their morning routine, offering her services with such genuine warmth that Rachel found herself accepting before she'd even properly considered it. The arrangement proved to be seemingly perfect. Mrs. Rose's Victorian house became Lily's after-school haven, filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies and the gentle ticking of antique clocks. The elderly woman helped with homework, prepared nutritious meals, and entertained Lily with stories that kept the child spellbound for hours. Rachel's guilt about working late began to fade, especially when she saw how Lily flourished under Mrs. Rose's attention. Yet as autumn approached, subtle discordant notes began to creep into their harmonious arrangement. Rachel first noticed it when helping Lily unpack her backpack one evening. Among the usual school papers and art projects, she found a strange piece of candy wrapped in ancient-looking paper, its text in a language she didn't recognize. When questioned, Lily merely shrugged, her usually chatty nature replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. During a rare weekend at home, Rachel visited Mrs. Rose to drop off some thank-you cookies she'd baked. The elderly woman's house was a museum of perfectly preserved antiquities, but something about the numerous photographs displayed on the walls made Rachel's skin prickle. They showed different children throughout the decades, all posed in the same garden, all wearing similar distant expressions. Mrs. Rose's explanation about former charges she'd cared for seemed reasonable, yet Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the chronology, about the way Mrs. Rose's appearance barely seemed to change across the years. The unease grew as October painted the neighborhood in shades of amber and gold. Lily began mentioning special tea parties with Mrs. Rose, describing elaborate rituals involving dried flowers and strange-smelling herbs. She started wearing a peculiar charm around her neck, a tarnished silver pendant that Mrs. Rose insisted was for protection against bad dreams. When Rachel suggested a weekend playdate with school friends, Lily threw an unprecedented tantrum, screaming that she only wanted to spend time at Mrs. Rose's house. During a late-night online search, Rachel discovered archived newspaper articles that made her blood run cold. Every decade since the 1970s, children had disappeared from their neighborhood and the surrounding areas. The cases remained unsolved, but they all shared an unsettling pattern. The children had vanished during the autumn months, and all had been described by their families as becoming increasingly withdrawn and obsessed with a new adult friend in the weeks before their disappearance. Rachel's discovery sent her into a spiral of frantic research. As rain peppered her office windows one evening, she pored over digitized records from the local library. The articles painted a disturbing picture. Mrs. Rose had lived in the same house since the 1960s, though neighbors' accounts suggested she'd barely aged. Each decade brought whispered rumors about her special connection with local children, followed by devastating disappearances that were never solved. The more Rachel dug, the more patterns emerged. Every missing child had shown similar changes in behavior, growing secretive, collecting strange objects, becoming intensely attached to an elderly friend. Their disappearances had all coincided with the autumn equinox, when the barrier between ordinary life and something darker supposedly grew thin. Rachel found herself reading about ancient folklore, about creatures that sustained themselves on youth and innocence, about magical bonds that could only be broken by a mother's love. At home, Lily's transformation accelerated. Her daughter's vibrant personality dimmed like a candle in the wind, replaced by a dreamy detachment that made Rachel's heart ache. The little girl's backpack continually produced disturbing treasures. Pressed flowers that seemed to whisper when touched, chunks of hard candy that smelled of decay, drawings of a familiar garden where the roses bloomed black. Lily's skin grew pale despite the lingering summer sun, and dark circles appeared beneath her eyes despite her claims of wonderful naps in Mrs. Rose's spare bedroom. Mrs. Rose began suggesting longer babysitting hours, insisting that Lily needed extra tutoring for imaginary academic struggles. She appeared at Rachel's door with increasing frequency, offering to take Lily for weekends, promising special trips and magical adventures. Her pleasant demeanor carried an edge now, her smile never quite reaching her eyes when Rachel declined. The elderly woman's presence seemed to fill more space than it should, and her shadow on the wall sometimes shifted in ways that defied natural law. One crisp October morning, Rachel arrived at her office to find an envelope filled with photographs on her desk. They had been delivered anonymously, and their contents made her grip her desk for support. The images spanned decades, showing Mrs. Rose with different children in her garden. In each progressive photo, the child appeared more translucent, more ethereal, while Mrs. Rose herself seemed to grow younger and more vibrant. The final photo in each series showed only Mrs. Rose, glowing with unnatural youth, standing alone among her ever-blooming roses. That afternoon, Rachel left work early, her heart pounding as she raced home through streets lined with falling leaves. The house was empty, Lily's backpack abandoned by the door. Next door, Mrs. Rose's Victorian stood dark and silent, its windows like dead eyes watching Rachel's approach. The roses in the garden had turned a deep, crimson red, their petals dripping with evening dew that looked unsettlingly like blood. The front door swung open at Rachel's touch, leading her into a house that seemed bigger on the inside than physics should allow. The antique-filled rooms stretched into impossible spaces, and the air grew colder as Rachel descended a staircase she'd never noticed before. In the basement, behind a door grown over with thorny vines, she found a chamber that defied explanation. The walls were lined with small alcoves, each containing treasures that made her stomach turn. Toys, clothes, and personal belongings that spanned generations, preserved like artifacts in a museum of lost innocence. And there, in the center of it all, stood Mrs. Rose. The elderly woman's appearance flickered like a faulty television signal, sometimes showing her familiar grandmotherly face, sometimes revealing something ancient and hungry that lurked beneath. Beside her, Lily sat in a child-sized rocking chair, her form already beginning to fade around the edges, her eyes distant and unseeing as Mrs. Rose's fingers combed through her hair with possessive tenderness. The time for pretense had ended. As autumn wind howled through the basement's hidden passages, Rachel faced the creature that had hidden behind Mrs. Rose's benevolent mask for decades, preparing herself for a battle that would determine not just Lily's fate, but the fate of every child who had vanished into this house of carefully maintained secrets and ever-blooming roses.